Hi, I am Jennifer Purcell, and welcome to my podcast, Living with an Invisible Learning Challenge, where we will discuss, discover, and learn more about the challenges and triumphs of those with NLD and other learning challenges. I do have a website for this podcast, and it is called livingwithnld.com. I also have a Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter account for the podcast. They are all under the same name, which is Living with NLD. I also have a YouTube channel for the podcast, which can be found by Googling the title of the podcast, which is Living with an Invisible Learning Challenge. I would like to tell you about a nonprofit that I use for my research for this podcast. It is called the NVLD Project, and I use their blog for my research. They are a nonprofit that is based in New York and is trying to get NVLD back on the DSM, and they provide many resources for people with NVLD on their website. I'll provide you with the website for them in the podcast description. All proceeds from the ads on this podcast will be donated towards the NVLD project. Please feel free to explore the other topics on the podcast, and hopefully you will learn something new from them. I hope you enjoy today's episodes. ADHD and autism, and I think he was 7, and he was particularly challenging because he could, with his tantrums, he could be pretty aggressive, and he cussed a lot.
Yeah, right.
um
Right. Yep.
and like I remember just always being on guard and being like ready to protect myself just in case.
Right.
um
Absolutely. Absolutely.
and like also wanting to protect him too, because sometimes he went to go grab, like one of the times he grabbed those lawn fluorescent tubes
Mhm.
or light bulbs in the ceiling. He grabbed one of those, and uh uh he was swinging around and it broke at one point, so that was dangerous.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that's a very it's not an uncommon fact pattern is what I'd say, is
Mhm.
that you see sometimes with these behaviors, it can be self-injurious. It can put the other folks at risk. And so you want to make sure that you're doing all of the things you can to address it, which is, I think, very much in line with kind of your experience with behavioral therapy, right? It's an applied behavior analysis or a board certified behavior analyst overseeing kind of some interventions, because you're trying to be very data driven and very scientific about the ways in which you approach the behavior rather than just reacting. And
Right.
sometimes I find schools sometimes just react, or they want to push away because it's difficult. And I recognize it's difficult. I've unfortunately seen a number of times where students have injured staff, and that's a very real
Mm.
kind of possibility. But that's why you put all of the other things in place to try to protect them, to try to protect the student. And sometimes my job truly is to unlock those resources. I've absolutely had situations where school folks have sort of slid my card under the table to families because they know something's wrong, but they know that they themselves can't advocate for it. Or it's getting the right people in the room who are willing to talk
Mhm.
about the issue to then be able to say, oh, okay, we actually have this person who could come in and help, that, maybe the team may not be able to sort of see when they're sort of in the weeds and on the ground of what's happening. So the hope is, even in those really heightened situations, that you can find a way to collaboratively work together to come up with a solution. I mean, certainly there are going to be extreme situations where maybe that school isn't the right place for that child and there needs to be an
Of course.
option. But the answer that I refuse to accept as an answer is the child just needs to be at home. The child doesn't need
Yeah.
to, that's the one where, we can figuratively come to blows a little bit more.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Um, I would assume that most of your clients have this, but do your clients usually have an IEP?
Yes, almost all of them do. I do have some clients that have, or I should say, or we're trying to get them found eligible for an IEP.
Mm-hmm.
That can also be kind of a legal challenge to getting the school to test, to getting them to be found eligible, to getting them to accept sort of independent evaluations and opinions. But yes, most of them have IEPs. I currently have and have had a handful that have had what we call 504 plans. So those are just accommodations. It's not services, it's not
Mm-hmm.
goals. Almost always, if you have a kid with a disability that has sort of a learning component to it, you want them to have the IEP because there are more protections and you'll get more rather than just the accommodations, which is just sort of it's the extra time, it's maybe it's a calm down corner, but it's not the intervention to learn how to deal with the behavior, for instance.
That makes sense to me. I mean, I had accommodations in college and
Right.
those were helpful for me. I never had an IEP.
Right. Well, I mean, because colleges, you can't have an IEP. It's
Right.
only accommodations. But I think, the your situation being fairly unique, I think, because you were homeschooled. And so there was
Mm-hmm.
sort of, I think naturally you probably got some individualized instruction that sort of helped
Yes.
things, right? That perhaps if you had been in a traditional public school may not have been available to you unless you had had one of these plans. So I have not had a student who's been diagnosed with nonverbal learning disability before. But I mean, it does really fit into kind of the learning disability realm and, getting
Mm-hmm.
services and things. I would expect that they would, be able to be found eligible to get the IEP to be able to get the services they need.
Yeah, I would think they would. I mean, I know that the MBLD project is working to have it be on the DSM, and once it's back on there, I think it would be easier for IEPs because then there's one agreed upon definition. That's why I was taken off before.
Okay.
And um I think that's even going to make it be easier to have people diagnosed with it because then you have one definition to look at of what this is.
Right. I think it's still, I don't necessarily expect that the law will change with the, addition to the DSM of this particular condition, but I do think that it would still fit under kind of what we call specific learning disability. So,
Hmm.
you have to have sort of a psychological processing kind of deficit and have it impact your academics in some way, in an adverse way. And I would expect that even just in the testing that's done, that you would, whether you get labeled having nonverbal learning disability or one of these other kinds of conditions that's sort of close but not totally it would probably still get you qualified for services. But obviously, I'm a big proponent of getting that independent educational evaluation to be able to really get in depth about what it is that is the challenge so that we can address it appropriately. Because if we treat
Right.
nonverbal learning disability like we treat, I'm going to use dyslexia as the example, we're going to be missing pieces of, what that child would need.
Yeah, that makes sense to me because I know for me sometimes I when I was not when I was handwriting my words, but when I was typing, sometimes I would flip-flop letters.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started recording the podcast, I realized that if I didn't underline the script, I would jump lines. And I was
Mm.
like, okay, that's a little bit dyslexia, but I wasn't diagnosed with that.
Right. I think a lot of symptoms overlap, which can make it hard to kind of
Hmm.
pinpoint exactly. I think we see that a lot with, ADHD, anxiety, and autism in particular. Like those three, I see that trifecta of diagnoses a lot, and it can be very hard to pull apart. Okay, like what's the autism, what's the anxiety, what's the ADHD, and how do they all feed together? And the reality is, like, it doesn't really matter which one is driving which thing, as long as we address the need But when it comes to sort of labeling and funding and all that, it can have some implications sort of with how the school addresses the child. So we want to be holistic and view the
Mm-hmm.
reality of the circumstances, but we also want to try to be precise where we can be.
That makes sense. Um, do you think it was easier or different working at William and Mary than Notre Dame?
That's a good question. I think, they're just different. I think that, I've only been at Notre Dame for a handful of months here, whereas I was at William and Mary for 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
My last year at William and Mary, I had a legal fellow who is working with me. Here I have a legal fellow who's working with me. I think having that support is really wonderful. And, it's helpful to, you're building another professional who's interested in the work and they're supporting, more families and that kind of thing. So capacity is great. The difference, I think, with Notre Dame is that, it's a obviously a Catholic institution. So I'm looking more, we're certainly addressing primarily public school students, but we're also starting to kind of look at, okay, well, a lot of the religious schools of any denomination really
Mm-hmm.
aren't serving these students. And is there a way to do that better? Indiana has sort of school choice laws, which, you can get into pros and cons of that. But I think it unlocks some funds for families that want to send their kids to a non-public school, and sort of look at that lens. So I'm very early on in my Notre Dame experience, but I think we're going to be a little broader in how we conceptualize education and placement and sort of appropriateness for students. So I'm excited about that kind of new challenge that, it's a uniquely kind of Notre Dame or religious sort of institution bend.
That makes sense to me. I didn't realize Notre Dame was Catholic.
Yes, yes, very fundamentally so is what I would say. It's very much sort of core to the Notre Dame sort of ethos and mission, and very much, I mean, what drew me to Notre Dame, in large
Hmm.
part as a Catholic myself.
That makes sense. Um, how was it to teach special ed law at William Mary?
Great, wonderful. I think it was fabulous to, I inherited a really wonderful structure. I had excellent predecessors. But I also got to make it my own over time. And I'm still in touch with a number of my students from there, which I really appreciate. I feel like we really got on the ground in our community and got to really serve a variety of folks and get to know sort of different issues. It was a really great sort of foundational, I think, professional experience for me. And it's obviously directly linked to sort of what I'm doing here
Hmm.
now, just a different institution.
Um, what did your parents engage in learning equity education advocacy clinic at William Mary do?
So the clinic at William Mary very much did the same kind of thing that we do at Notre Dame. So I would teach
Hmm.
students, they would, represent families primarily in IEP meetings, but we would go to things like mediation to try to solve problems if we couldn't solve them at sort of that lower level. So it was primarily that kind of advocacy and trying to solve things sort of around the table. That's sort of the best description I can give you. It's very, again, very the model is very similar to sort of what I'm doing here at Notre Dame, just sort of different place, different sort of priorities of I have multi-jurisdictional clients, for instance, now, whereas I didn't have that before.
Okay. Um, what do you like most and least about your job?
So I'll say the least part first. I think
Hmm.
when you see that there are times with special education issues where it can be very frustrating. The emotions run very high. You're dealing with a child, and it can feel like when you're not making the progress you want to make in solving the problem, that child is actively being harmed in the process, right?
Hmm.
And so I think just with any kind of bureaucracy, it's not going to all get solved overnight. So the time can be frustrating. The fact that issues repeat themselves can be frustrating because it's like, I've solved this problem before. Why can't everyone just agree to do it
Mhm.
this other way? So I think, part of that lends me toward, I need to get a little bit more involved in kind of like bigger picture policy kind of things, but it can be very frustrating kind of in the moment, when you're trying to solve a problem and you just feel like it's either a problem that can't be solved or it's just going to take an incredible amount of time. Things I like the most about my job, certainly like I'm really happy to be back in the teaching kind of aspect of it. After my time, I loved the Marine Corps. It was great to kind of be my own lawyer for a long time or for a while and not necessarily be training other folks, but I do really love sort of seeing students grow, and there's always this like aha moment where they kind of come into their own and see themselves as
Mhm.
do something or come up with an idea or a plan and execute it really well. That's very rewarding. I also I love when we can finally get over some hump and a child succeeds is obviously a huge benefit to the work that we've done. I'm fortunate in that a lot of students or parents will actually still keep in touch with me periodically. So, I'll get graduation photos and
Aw.
see kind of that things have progressed and that things are better, when, things go well. So I'm always happy. It's not, it doesn't happen in every case. But when you're able to make that connection and you can see it through, it's really exciting.
I can imagine that. I mean, I know when I was at Berkeley, and I remember what it was like before I had my accommodations, and I was had C's in my classes, and then when I got them, they went up to B's and A's. It was like, oh, obviously it's working and helping.
Right, right. Well, and I mean, good for you for being the self-advocate that you needed, that some people will stay in that kind of more, that they will think it's just them, right?
Hmm.
That there's not something that can be done. But I've actually had students that have had accommodations myself, like law students, and it's really great to see when they really own it and try to really advocate for themselves and get what they need out of a process that isn't, because let's just be honest, like the education system as a whole really isn't built for people who, have these disabilities, think differently, do those things. But we all know like what an asset people like you, Jennifer, are to like our society and our community. So I'm always really excited when I see them kind of pushing into those spaces that have not necessarily been built for them.
Thank you. Yeah, I remember when I um just how proud of myself I was when my mom was able to help me for 2 years for proofreading my essays, and I know I wouldn't have been able to graduate without her help. Um, and I remember when we were at the graduation ceremony for my sociology department, she kind of was laughing at some of the inside jokes because she knew what they were talking about with the different like authors that I was reading because she remembered the names.
Well, it's really wonderful that you had that support, right? And that
Yes.
that she was able to assist you kind of through it. But like you also got there on your own, right? And yes, she
Right.
helped you, but you crossed the finish line. So that's, it's quite an accomplishment.
Yeah. Yeah. She yeah, I mean, that's true. And I remember like it was so cool when I was applying. I was like, I didn't even think I was gonna get in, but then Jonathan was like, just try. So I'm glad I did.
Yes, good.
Um,
Good.
what
Jonathan
would you
can be
say?
pushy in a good way, right?
Yeah, he did push me in a good way. Yeah. Um, what would you say you've learned about special needs from your job and your clients?
Hmm. I've learned so much, so much. I think
Mm-hmm.
I've learned a lot of particulars about, how do you address different things? Because part of my job, yes, I'm a lawyer, I'm teaching law, but the law is really operating in the background of, okay, what does the kid actually need, and how do you figure that out, and what is the education system like? So I've learned a lot about different kinds of interventions, because if in order for me to recommend something, I've got to learn about it. So I've gotten to know experts in different fields, to be able to sort of make those recommendations and to try to serve the client. So that's been a really wonderful experience of getting to put a different kind of hat on and really delve into, okay, well, how does this thing work? Recognizing that, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a teacher, I'm not, I don't have a PhD in special ed. Like it's just whatever I can kind of grab and the experts that I can pull in. I think the other kind of components, I think you realize, because I'm primarily dealing with the parents and not as much with the students, you really see how much the child's disability and abilities sort of affect the whole family, and how,
Right.
that can be quite a stressor, certainly. I think you also see situations where there can sometimes be a little bit of a mismatch between what the parents want and what the child wants, and or what
Mm,
the child thinks the child needs. And so I've also learned a lot about, how to talk to them and like get their input and understand where they're coming from, and to try to kind of find the right balance. Ultimately, we're not necessarily, you're not going to, when a child's saying, I don't need help, and like all the evidence is saying they need help, like you're going to get them help, right? But you're going to
yes.
find ways for them to try to be more accepting of the help. And again, sometimes that's conversation, but a lot of times that's like, okay, well, maybe they need a therapist to work with them to try to understand,
Mm,
or they need to experience the tutor, or help with the teacher, get that bond. I think the other component that I think is really interesting is just how relationship based this area is, right? From the child to the teacher, the child to, whomever they're interacting with. When that
hmm
person approaches them as, a gift and, a person, and not a problem and a number and a dollar sign, it really changes, I think, the way that child
mm,
feels about themselves. It's also the relationship between the parent and the school. And sometimes my job is to try to run interference, and try to kind of take some of the emotion out of it. But also at the same time, I always have to be thinking about, like, this family is going to be dealing with the school district for a lot longer than I'm going to be involved. I've had cases that have gone on for years and years, but not 18 years, or not, how,
wow.
so I think, it's important to kind of pay attention to sort of how those dynamics um, are and can evolve sort of over time. And I have seen that happen. I've seen situations where we've been at loggerheads and it seemed really desperate and terrible, and it's turned around when something, happens, and it can turn into a more positive relationship. Um, I think the resilience of these families, children included, is, something that can't be undersold. It's pretty remarkable, the things that folks can go through and come out on the other side of. And I think you always have to have that hope that things are going to be getting better in some
Hmm
way. And, I just try to play whatever role I can to try to help with that process.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I know for myself when I've had challenges of uh keeping the positive in mind and
Mhm.
seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. Um, it just it's good to remember where you've been and kind of where you are now, and compare the two, um, and be able to remind yourself of how far you've come.
Definitely.
Um, and I was gonna say, when you were talking about comorbidity earlier, I know what that's like a little bit because of having NLD and having migraines at the same time. So it's like, yes, they're not exactly related, but I feel like there's some connection because in some of the research I've done, um, it seems like more neurodivergents have chronic migraines or have migraines in general.
Mhm.
And it's interesting for me to see, okay, there's not really that much research done on how does this medication help you when you have migraines or something else when you're
Right.
neurodivergent versus neurotypical.
Right. No, that's a really good point. I think I think that's true in a lot of, the medication kind of side of things can be such a challenge in any in any kind of area
Hmm.
that you're needing medication in. There's often side effects, but it's this question of like balance, right? Of like, is it helping more than it's hurting, right? And can we try to minimize the hurting, and maximize the helping? You see that a lot with like ADHD medication.
Right.
That's something that can be really it's a difficult decision, I think, for a lot of families to put their child on it. I've seen it do wonders. I've also seen it not do wonders, right? Or it takes a lot of trial and error to sort of find the right dosage that works for that child. And when you're dealing with children who are growing, like that's not going to, it's likely that it's going to change over time. And I think sometimes we look for, we expect it to be a long lasting solution. And sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. It just, varies by the individual. But no, I very much understand that, the medication thing, it doesn't always, play out the way that we expect it to with people who have multiple sort of conditions that they're battling at any given time.
That makes sense. So how many families have you helped and are able to keep in touch with them over over the time that you've done special needs?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't have a number off the top of my head. It's hard for me to give you a good sense, but um, I'd say, the keep in touch is probably in the like, 10 to 20 range, somewhere in there. At various points,
Hmm.
probably a little on the closer to the 10 than the 20. It just depends on how long, things have progressed. But I've had folks that have reached out to me, several years later, that maybe we haven't been in touch, and but something happens and they'll reach out, which is always really wonderful. But I'd say but the stories and the family stay with me, like very much so. Even when
Mm.
the relationship ends, it's those are folks that, I've certainly learned a lot from. And I think, those kids still sort of, I still have students that will reach out to me, former students who will say, have you heard anything about so and so? Or, it stays with them too, which means like I think it's an impactful experience that we're all kind of going through together. So I would stay in touch with all of them if I could, but you also have to make space for folks that are currently having issues and trying to focus on them at the same time. So it can be a balance, but I'm very fortunate to have had a lot of really wonderful families to work with over time.
That makes sense. I was going to ask, do your students help with their clients as well?
Oh yeah, so they're like the primary sort of contact. They're supposed to be working on the cases. I'm supposed to be supervising. So what that
Okay.
means is that, I'm looking over anything before they send it to the client. I'm reading anything they send over to the school. I go to all the meetings and make sure that they're saying what they need to say. But but I'll say, like, that doesn't mean that I'm completely
Hmm.
hands off, right? I'm still involved quite a bit. It's just that the goal is to try to get the students to learn how to be lawyers in a safe kind of environment where there's backup. And because, ultimately they're practicing under my license and under my supervision. And so the hope is that they're doing a lot of the intensive client work. But yes, I'm still involved. It's just it's kind of a different, you're taking a little bit of a backseat, but I'm still part of strategy discussions and all those kinds of things.
That makes sense. Are there any questions you have for me?
Absolutely. So Jennifer, like, tell me about, so, I mentioned that, a lot of the time I'm dealing with parents and not the
Hmm.
individuals themselves. So what would be helpful for people like me to know, or even parents to know, about nonverbal learning disability, and like what's helpful versus what isn't helpful? Because I think sometimes I have that disconnect where parents think something's going to be helpful because they read it somewhere, but like, again, when you talk to the child or you learn more about it, you're like, oh, that's actually not all that helpful.
That's a good question. I think what's good to know about NLD, mainly for me, I mean, it affects everybody a little bit different. It's kind of like autism that way, where um, there's a spectrum of the symptoms, and there's different degrees that you're going to experience them, of course. So for me, I find most of my challenges, in the beginning, most of mine were social, I would say, where I was having challenges with reading um, body language and noticing my own tone of voice, and like
Mhm.
when I would um, say something, I wouldn't realize that I had like a frustrated edge to it or something, or like I was angry. I didn't realize I would have that until hopefully what you can do with these episodes on this podcast, Living with Invisible Learning Challenge, I would like to challenge you to journal about the episodes and just see what you learn from them. Or you can share about the episodes with your friends and family and see what they can learn from them. And as always, I will post the links to the articles that I use in the description of the podcast. And please let me know if you know somebody who you think would want to be interviewed on this podcast, or if you yourself would want to be interviewed. Please email me. I have my email on my website, and I also have it pretty much pretty accessible on Facebook and Instagram through messaging as well. So you can get in contact with me in those ways.